Alright, let's do this. Most of the campaign for this general election has been about the leaders. It's constantly been attacks on Jeremy Corbyn and his character rather than the Labour Party, and it's been talking about Theresa May's strong and stable leadership. I intend to make another short video briefly discussing the leaders because I feel like I can't ignore it, but I think it's really about time we just forgot about the leaders for a second and get back to the manifestos and the policies and the parties, because at the end of the day, unless you live in Maidenhead or Islington North, you're not going to be voting for Theresa May or Jeremy Corbyn. It's time we stop obsessing about those two and start thinking locally. So you should look up your local candidates. It's very easy to do. If they haven't put something through your letterbox, you just look up their website, read their policies. You can also use They Work For You, where you can find out the voting record of the MPs, which is a really helpful way to see if they put their money where their mouth is. So my intention in this video is to essentially present the points from the manifestos, look at the parties and look at their national views, and also give a little bit of analysis of each. Now, obviously I can't discuss everything. I'm going to cover as much as I can, but I'll leave all the links to various manifesto analyses in the description, which come from a variety of sources and political leanings. I will then finish off with a brief assessment of the viability of each manifesto. So with that, let's jump right in with Brexit, immigration and the future of the UK. So the Conservatives want us to leave the single market and the custom union in order to seek a deep and special relationship with the EU. Their catchphrase, as you may have heard, is "no deal is better than a bad deal." Now, your views on this stance will depend how you feel about the single market and whether you think that we will be able to negotiate a good trade deal outside of it. Personally, I kind of doubt it. The thing that worries me most about this particular stance is that the idea that a no deal is better than a bad deal, it doesn't make sense. It's incredibly hard line, so it doesn't allow for the remainers. If you don't get any deal, you don't get any of the good things from the EU, no deal is a bad deal. It's such a counterintuitive statement in itself. I'm amazed that it's become such a pinnacle of that campaign. It just doesn't make sense. So Labour, in contrast, are very against this no deal option, and they say that if by the end of the 2 years we haven't reached a deal, then they will make transitional arrangements. They also propose to scrap the existing negotiating priorities and instead emphasise the single market. Now, some have criticised this as being unrealistic or that it's Brexit regardless of how damaging it is, but to me, making transitional arrangements sounds a lot safer than not having any kind of deal at all. But the biggest problem with both of these stances is that neither party is really representing the Remainers, who are a legit portion of the country. Various critics have said that the Labour stance is less open-ended. Saying no deal is better than a bad deal kind of means that they're free to do whatever they want with negotiations, and that could lead to some chaos. Now, the Conservatives have said that they would like to determine fair settlement of rights and obligations. Basically means that they want to safeguard EU nationals living in Britain and British nationals living in EU, and assess our contributions to EU programmes to decide whether or not it's fair to continue funding them. The main thing is the Great Repeal Bill. This would convert EU law to UK law, excluding the Fundamental Charter of Rights. All of the plans to do with the EU Convention of Human Rights has kind of been sidelined for a bit, and we will remain signatories on the convention until after Brexit. Labour has a somewhat similar stance, but they're particularly pushing the point that they would like to guarantee the rights of EU citizens living in Britain and British nationals living in the EU, and they want to replace the Great Repeal Bill with the EU Rights Protection Bill, which ensures no changes to workers' rights or environmental protections. Now, looking at immigration, Conservatives have once again pledged to reduce net migration to under 100,000. This is generally considered a positive thing. However, a lot of people have pointed out that this was promised in the last 2 elections and we haven't seen anywhere close to those figures, and there has actually been little faith even within the cabinet of Theresa May that these pledges are possible. By contrast, Labour isn't putting any number commitment with immigration. Jeremy Corbyn in a couple of debates has vaguely said that he would expect it to reduce, but they're not trying to make pledges that frankly they can't make and that no one can make. In general, Conservatives are going to be much harsher on immigration, and they're going to make it harder to come into the country. They're going to charge employers more money for hiring a foreign worker, they're going to increase the minimum earnings for a family visa, and they're going to make it harder for students to stay after they've finished their studies. By contrast, Labour is looking to scrap income thresholds for the spouses of migrants. They're going to take students out of immigration figures. And in general, they're going to be focusing on the Migrant Impact Fund, which looks at giving money to areas to help combat the effects of immigration. And the final thing in this section is the Scottish independence referendum. It's come up again since the Brexit result. Essentially, both parties oppose it. Labour, I think, categorically, whereas the Conservatives are against it until after Brexit. So moving on to the next topic, economy, taxes, money, all of that stuff. As a general rule, Conservatives want less tax, Labour wants more tax. Both of them say that there will be no increase in VAT, but Labour also says there will be no increase on national insurance, which helps out self-employed people. The Conservatives have increased the tax allowance, which means that you don't pay tax if you earn up to 12.5 thousand, and they've also raised the threshold for the 40p tax rate up to 50,000. Labour isn't changing the tax rates for lower earners, but for the top 5%, they'll be increasing it to 45p, and that new threshold will be at 80,000 rather than 150,000. This is in general to try and reduce the wage discrepancy between the tops and the bottoms of companies, but a lot of people have criticised it, saying that it will spark a mass tax avoidance. This is a valid criticism, but it's also worth noting they have pledged more power to the HMRC, who work against tax avoidance. But the one that Labour has been really attacked on is corporation tax. Conservatives want to reduce it to 17% by 2020, which I would like to point out is incredibly low. It would put us at one of the lowest in the world, and some people say that it would turn us into a tax haven. Labour, on the other hand, want to raise corporation tax to 26%, which a lot of people have been really getting worried about, but it is worth noting that this is less than it was in 2010, when it was 28%. This particular statement of Labour is one that has received a lot of criticism, but it is worth pointing out, do we want businesses to come to our country because we're a tax haven, or do we want businesses because we have a strong economy, we have lots of social spending, which means that more people can spend more money? There's no doubt that there is a risk in raising corporation tax, but it really isn't going up to crazy levels. Welfare and pensions. This has been a particular area where the Conservatives have been attacked. After 2020, they want to remove the triple lock on pensions. Now, the triple lock on pensions is where pension payments rise with inflation, average wages, and 2.5%. They want to remove that extra 2.5%. Labour, on the other hand, want to keep the triple lock. The Conservatives also want to bring in means testing for the winter fuel allowance. So this would involve assessing people's incomes and assessing whether they need the allowance. If you can afford to pay winter fuel, then you don't get that unnecessary help, which admittedly is a fairer system, but there has been concerns about how many people it could affect. As expected, Labour wants to keep the winter fuel allowance and all other benefits such as the free bus pass. When I looked into welfare spending, I found very little about the Conservatives, and I realised that was explained by the statement, "No plans for further radical welfare reform." Basically, the Conservatives don't really want to change anything, which has a lot of people concerned because there has been a lot of criticism of how benefits, particularly the PIP, and how it's been working. It generally seems that the current welfare system is not helping people enough, or not helping enough people. As to be expected, Labour is on the other end of the scale. They want to increase employment allowance, the carers allowance, and they want to end the freeze on welfare benefits. So at the moment, welfare benefits are capped. Labour wants those payments to rise according to inflation. Labour also supports more free childcare in general. Now, a quick note on benefits in general. The main criticism of them is that it encourages people to be lazy or to just stay unemployed, and instead that work is the best way out of poverty. So I did a lot of research into this, and I read various articles. I tried to get as many sources as possible, and after an evening of reading on it, the conclusion seems to be that work is the best way out of poverty, but it's definitely yes with a big old but. It depends on various conditions, and generally social spending and benefits have been found to be a more consistent way out of poverty. I will leave the articles below if you want to read up more on it. I just thought I'd mention that given the topic. Health, the NHS and social care. The Conservatives have pledged £8 billion for the NHS over the next 5 years. It sounds like a lot, but it's been highly criticised. Plenty of sources have said that this simply won't be enough, and one reason for this is that we are experiencing the largest sustained drop in the percentage of the GDP going towards the NHS. So though there's more money going in, it's not enough of a percentage of the money. And let's face it, this is coming from a government that wouldn't fund £5.5 million, which is not a lot in the grand scheme of things, to update our IT services. And what happened as a result? the cyber attack a few weeks ago, which nearly crippled our NHS for a couple of days. Labour, on the other hand, are pledging £30 billion for the NHS over the next 5 years. And generally, they're not going the way of privatisation like the Conservatives, and they want to look into public control. A little personal note, I've witnessed myself the effects of privatisation. I'm currently having physiotherapy for my broken elbow, and there was another woman in my session, and she wanted more sessions because she was still in pain and she still couldn't do a lot of things, and they just had to say, we haven't got enough room in the waiting list. You're going to have to go to Virgin Care. It's going to be expensive, but it's the only thing we can do. It's minor, I know. Even I have witnessed the real life effects of privatisation. Now, obviously the £30 billion is a lot, but we'll get on to how the manifesto is being costed a little bit later. It's also worth noting that the NHS is held up by EU migrants. I can attest, as someone who spent 4 days in hospital, the vast majority of the people working are migrants, and it's only Labour, not Conservative, that have guaranteed the EU NHS workers' rights. Literally no mention of it in the Conservative manifesto. Looking at social care is a little bit difficult with the Conservatives because they've had so many U-turns and clarifications, but from what I can gather, what they're planning to do is that you pay social care bills until you have £100,000 of assets left. What they're changing is that this includes the family home, but they've also promised that you won't have to sell your home in order to pay the bills, as you don't pay them until after the death. Labour is looking at founding a national care service and tend to put £8 billion into social care over the next 5 years. Education, schools and university. The Conservatives have pledged to increase the schools budget by £4 billion. However, once again, this has been really put under fire. The IFS, National Audit Office, Education Policy Institute and the Public Accountancy Committee have all analysed the data and said that with regards to inflation, that this budget increase will actually show a per pupil funding reduction. For example, there was a woman on Question Time who said it would be an £898 reduction per pupil per year. Now, I'm not sure if that's verified, but that's a pretty horrific figure if it is true. And certainly a lot of organisations there have expressed real concerns. By contrast, Labour have pledged £6 billion per year in the budget. They've proposed to end the public sector pay cap, so basically pay teachers more, and they're also looking to reduce class sizes. Another thing that the Conservatives have really come under fire for is free lunches. Labour wants to keep the scheme. Conservatives want to turn them into free breakfasts. However, many people have said that the budget isn't enough and that it could actually cost treble the £60 million that they've set aside for it. And also, on a purely practical note, I can't help but feel that lunches are far more efficient to give to a child than breakfast. Another major talking point has been that the Conservatives want to end the ban on selective schools, which basically means bring in more grammar schools, whereas Labour is against grammar schools as a principle. Now, I have complex enough feelings on this to make an entire separate video. I'm not going to, but that just all depends on your views on selective education and how you want our education system to work. And finally, Labour's major selling point in education has been that they want to abolish university tuition fees and bring back the maintenance grants. This is compared to the Conservatives, who abolished the maintenance grants in the first place, and they're looking to continue to raise the tuition fees. Now, this is one where I think it's a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to really love the idea of abolishing tuition fees, and I have to admit that in principle I do agree with it because I think that education is a right. But in the practicalities of using those tuition fees to fund scholarships and to provide the grants to help lower income students, I think that tuition fees can serve a purpose. It's whether or not they're actually serving that purpose at the moment, whether it's just going into the pockets of the higher-ups in the universities. So though this is one of Labour's major selling points, it's actually not very popular, particularly because it would be quite expensive at £11.2 billion. The environment and transport. The Conservatives want to invest £40 billion in transport services over the next 10 years, and they generally want to be working with train companies to assure a minimum service level, so stop stuff like Southern Rail, and they also want to sort out the mess that is ticket pricing. Can I just point out, though, how much the Conservatives are willing to spend on transport compared to the NHS? Yeah, if I have to. By stark contrast, Labour wants to renationalise the railways. In terms of the environment, the Conservatives have just left out anything on air pollution measures, whereas they want to expand Heathrow Airport. By stark contrast, Labour wants to bring in a new Clean Air Act, particularly looking at diesel fumes, and they also want to ban fracking. The final subject is defence and foreign relations. Now, this one's actually fairly simple. They're surprisingly cohesive on this. Both parties want a commitment to institutions such as NATO. Both parties want a 2% of the GDP spent on defence, and both parties want to maintain the 0.7% of the GDP spent on foreign aid. That's a police car. How surprising in a Conservative government. In general, they're surprisingly similar, actually, but it's become under a lot of fire in the debate. With regards to the Conservative manifesto, it's very telling that they make no mention of the refugee crisis. The best that they do is that they want to redefine the legal definition of a refugee, aka they want to reduce the number of refugees by just defining fewer people as refugees. The Labour manifesto does support the renewal of Trident, which isn't very popular, but then it's adhering to the Parliament vote that's already happened. But what they do clarify is that Jeremy Corbyn would be extremely cautious about ordering the actual firing of a nuclear weapon. And a little note on this, because if you saw the Leaders' Question Time special where they went crazy about nuclear weapons, it doesn't matter whether the nuclear weapon is being used first or as a retaliation. The moment a nuclear weapon is fired in this world where so many people have nuclear arms, it spells disaster for all of us. Personally, I would rather a leader that is extremely cautious about using the weapon rather than Theresa May, who proudly got up in Parliament to just shout, yes, of course I would. So that's all of the manifesto points. So now I'm just going to briefly look at, the viability of the manifestos. That's been a major talking point in itself, just whether either of these manifestos are actually possible. Now, I feel like Labour's borne the brunt of this. They've come under particular attack for having all these pipe dreams. I will give one such example in the description below, an article from The Telegraph picking apart their manifesto, and particularly its costings. Now, what I would say in response to this is that the Labour manifesto is fully costed, unlike the Conservative, and also their economic plans are not universally panned. In fact, 40 leading economists dismissed the idea that they were particularly extreme measures. It's just they're not austerity measures. That said, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, I will link the article below, has criticised both of the manifestos. They've said that both of them have major dangers or impossibilities within their budgets and their plans on spending. The fact is that manifestos do tend to be a bit pipe dreamy. It's, hey, look at what we could do if we had all of the seats in Parliament. And that leads me on to my concluding points. All of the manifestos, in fact, of every party needs to be taken with a pinch of salt because there's so much uncertainty with Brexit. But what is worth considering is that the Conservatives have a chance of winning majority in this election. That's why they called it in the first place. What that means is that all of their measures that have been highly criticised could come true. And also we would see a continuation of the strains on social services that we've already seen. Whether that's teachers struggling, or the NHS under such strain, and I've seen that myself a lot recently, or whether it's the defence cuts, which arguably led to the London and Manchester attacks, Tories could win a majority and they could do all the things that seem to be so damaging. By contrast, Labour will not win a majority. I can guarantee you. The most optimistic polls are just saying that the Conservatives won't quite win a majority. That's the best we can hope for. So if you're leaning towards Labour, but you're concerned about the more extreme views, you don't need to be, because things like abolishing the university tuition fees, it's just not going to happen. In this election, it's more about approach. Do we want a party that approaches our country and how we spend its things with austerity and cuts? Or do we want a government that looks at social spending and helping people? There's arguments for both sides, of course there is, but what I'm saying is that any extreme measure, particularly in the Labour manifesto, but also the Conservative one, you don't need to be put off voting for that party but by a couple of extreme measures, because no one's going to be able to do exactly what they want to do, but particularly Labour. A lot of people feel betrayed by Labour because of Jeremy Corbyn or whatever, but you just don't need to be. Please don't be scared of voting Labour if that's how you intend to vote. But on the flip side, do be slightly scared of the Conservatives because they actually might get the majority that they would need. Okay, that was one heck of a video. I spent over 10 hours researching it, so I hope it's been helpful. Do share it around. We've only got a couple of days left to the election now, and let's get discussions, let's talk about it. There's so much information out there and it's really hard to wade through it, so I think it's really healthy to talk about it and be cynical of everything you read. Okay, that's everything. Goodbye.